Hello, can you hear me? All right, we're going to get started. Sorry for the delay. Today we had a couple issues with audio, with food being a little bit late. Can I have your attention, please? Awesome. Thank you so much. My name is Matthew Bell, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here today for a special event. For those not members of the Federalist Society, just very quickly, the Federalist Society, we're a group of conservative and libertarian students across the country, students, lawyers, scholars, professors, all throughout the country, even internationally. We're here to promote, foster debate, the sharing of ideas, and let people decide on their own. We believe that the judiciary is to say what the law is, and no, to say what the law is as opposed to make a law. And today we're very excited to have a very special event. We're welcoming back Dr. James Phillips, who's been a faculty here, an adjunct here at BYU. He currently works at Curtin McConkie. We're also very grateful to have Dean Christine Hurt with us, who's our Dean of Faculty and Curriculum. And since we got started a little bit late, I'll turn the time over to them. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you to the Federal Society for the invitation, and for Dean Hurt for taking time out of her schedule to provide some commentary. I figured I was originally planning on talking about the impact of law school on your views, but I decided to scrap that, and we're just going to talk about the Kavanaugh hearings. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, so let me explain the title first. These are your views. These are your views on law school. Any questions? Those of you who grew up in the 80s, this may sound a little familiar. I took this from a public service ad that played when I was a kid that some of you may remember. Let's see if this will work. Okay, anybody ever seen that? Few of you? Okay. Actually, I don't think going to law school is like being on drugs, but sometimes you have to have a catchy title. So let's see if it will let me move on to the next one. No, doesn't like what I'm doing. There we go. All right, so how in the world might law school affect the way we view things, particularly politics? I mean, it's easy to understand why the law school might affect our view of the rule against perpetuities, since we didn't have one before we came to law school. And now we probably do, and most of us probably hate it. But what about other things? Could law school potentially affect that? I don't know. That's the question. So why might it? Studies have found that your political orientation begins to solidify and is most influenced in your late adolescent and early adulthood years. Okay, so that kind of corresponds with law school for a lot of people, but maybe law school is a little too late in that process. So maybe it's undergrad really where that formation takes place. So could or could not. Law faculties, on average, are overwhelmingly of one political orientation across the nation. There are exceptions. BYU is one of those exceptions. So on average, about 2/3 of law faculty consider themselves to be liberal or progressive. About 10 to 15% consider themselves to be conservative or libertarian, and the remaining are kind of in the middle or kind of unknown. So maybe that has an impact on people's political views, the fact that their law professors tend to have one political view. Although you also see that in undergrad as well. And the argument against that would be, well, law and politics are distinct. Although on the other hand, I think a lot of people might argue that politics has a definite relationship with the law. So again, we have these counteracting potential influences. And finally, maybe there's something about learning how to think like a lawyer, right? That analogical reasoning, that case method. Maybe that somehow impacts political views, or maybe it's just completely irrelevant. Another thing that might point against it is, the first year courses aren't for the most part, overtly political, torts, contracts, property, not necessarily super political topics. Here at BYU, you take a con law class your first year, right? Okay, so a lot of places do that, but not every place. So maybe there's not a lot of politics in the first year curriculum. So this survey here, I guess I'll come back to that. Okay, so other people have tried to get at this a little bit. In 2003, there was a study, and they surveyed people just before they started their first year of law school, and again, just before graduation. So there, the treatment, so to speak of this in kind of an experimental design, even though it's not, would have been all of law school, right? That whole process, that whole experience, which is more than just the classroom, it's the extracurricular things that are coming into play there, it's the summer work experiences, all of that, okay? What they found is that students tend to describe their views as more liberal overall at the end of those 3 years, and on specific issues, LGBT rights, affirmative action for women, and government spending for the poor, they also were more liberal in their views. Interestingly, they were more conservative on defense spending after 3 years in law school. Why could that be? Well, this happened, this period of law school happened before and after 9/11. So it could have been external events that could have potentially influenced that. And that's always a problem. We'll talk about that in a minute. So they had some problem with their controls in that study. After 3 years of law school, they didn't really have a control group to compare these students to, so it's a little bit hard to know whether everybody else was also changing in their views. And again, the treatment's kind of amorphous, just kind of this 3-year period while you're in law school. 2009, we had another study. This one looked just at Yale 1Ls. And it was a bit of a natural experiment. In general, you don't get to pick your 1L classes. Certainly, you don't at Yale. And so you just get assigned to professors. And what they did there was they broke professors into groups based on their academic background. So some of the professors had more of an economic oriented background, others had more of a humanities, and then they had some that were kind of neutral that acted as the control. And what they found was that after that 1 year with the professors who had more of the economic ideas, the students tend to emphasize efficiency a little bit more, had a little bit higher indexical selfishness, whereas those who are with the humanities professors tend to emphasize equity or equality more. So that was interesting. There's a bit of a generalizability problem because Yale 1Ls don't look like all the rest of the 1Ls in the country, right? So does that, can you say that would happen across all 1Ls in the country? Probably not. Okay, so let's think here for a second. What is the treatment? What could possibly, from the first year of law school, affect your views on various political and law-related issues? And here's the reason why this study only looks at the 1L year. That's because it's the most uniform across schools and students, right? Generally, most of the country is taking the exact same classes with a little bit of on the margins, whether you have an elective or some places you get an elective, some places you don't. But most everybody's taking the same classes. There's only a few textbooks that generally get used. So there's as much uniformity as you could hope for across schools. And also generally you haven't had work experience yet, okay? Generally not a lot of work experience your 1L year, not quite as much extracurricular activity your 1L year. So it's an attempt to try to keep the treatment as uniform as possible by just limiting to the 1L year. Now, that may mean that we miss stuff, right? Some studies of undergraduates have shown that one of the things where college most affects their political views is actually being able to do research with a professor. And maybe you're more likely to do research with a professor in law school as a 2L or a 3L than a 1L, so maybe we're missing some stuff. But trying to keep the treatment as uniform as possible. Okay, so what could it be? Well, maybe there's something about the first year curriculum, or that really learning how to think like a lawyer that you have to start to figure out that first year. Maybe that's doing something. Again, maybe it's the political views of professors rubbing off on students. Maybe it's just graduate education in general. Maybe it's not law school, nothing unusual about law school, but maybe graduate education. Maybe it's maturation, right? Just that age, that period of life can lead to changes in views. Or maybe it's external events. So you have to try to figure out how to control for some of these things. So whenever you have a survey design, kind of a pre-test and a post-test, so 2 waves of survey to see if something happened, there's different things that can undermine the validity of your results. And it's generally not possible to perfectly get rid of all of these. You do your best, and then you try to be transparent on where there are problems. So one is just history, external events, right? If I'm trying to see what people's views are on gun control, and I survey them, and then a year later I survey them again, and in between there have been several school shootings, it's a little unclear whether it's the school shootings that may drive the views or whether it was the thing that I was trying to test for. Maturation, right? People's views can change just based on life experience and their age. Testing, sometimes when you test somebody, when you survey somebody on something, it may be something they hadn't really thought about before. But it can influence the next wave of surveys. If your surveys are different, if the wording is different the second time around, then you can get different results, and it's a false sense of a change. Regression to the mean. Anybody here ever heard in sports of the sophomore slump? Nobody? Oh, a few people shaking heads? Okay. Generally, when there is an extreme initial value on something, and in sports, this is say somebody has a really great rookie year, generally there's going to be a regression back to the average. Okay, so you're generally not going to see that same outlier again in the repeat, which is called in sports the sophomore slump. But if you see extreme results on a survey, they're automatically most likely going to come a little bit more to the middle on the second wave. Finally, you can have selection problems. If your control and your treatment groups were selected through different processes, then you could have differences between them that have nothing to do with the so-called treatment, right? So that's why in experimental design, which is the gold standard, you're randomly assigning people to treatment or control. I just can't do that in the real world. I mean, it would be great to be able to take a bunch of people who got accepted into law school and then randomly pick half of them and say, you have to wait a year. So that we could see what the first year of law school does, but that's neither ethical nor going to happen. So finally, people drop out, right? In the second wave of surveying, you're just not going to be able to get a hold of some people, or some people are going to be like, yeah, I'm not that interested in taking the survey the second time. How do those look different? Are the people who are dropping out different than the people who are staying in? And that could also affect it. Okay, so let's talk about this one. So this was funded by the Templeton Foundation. I can't remember how much money something like $30,000, I don't remember exactly. And there are 3 groups that were surveyed. Okay, the first is law students, incoming law students. Now, can somebody tell me where you can find a list of all the incoming law students in the United States? Okay, the LSAT is going to have a list of all the people who applied, right? And that would be better than nothing. Unfortunately, they don't release that information. So the trick is every school knows who they've let in, who they've accepted, but there isn't really a centralized database. And so that creates a huge problem in figuring out what is the population that you're trying to sample. There really is no good kind of centralized way to get at that. So law students were surveyed here. Plus, you also have the whole idea of you have to get It was called IRB approval from institutions in order to survey their students. And so, not ideal, but what I had to do was go to various law schools and say, hey, I'm doing this study. I would like to somehow get a hold of these incoming law students who nobody knows who they are yet except you, and send them this survey for which they get a $15 Amazon card. And some universities would say, yeah, we could do that, or well, no, we're not going to send out an email, but we'll let you post it on the 1L Facebook page, or no thanks, move on, please. So again, not the ideal way, but often with difficult populations, you kind of have to get at them however you can. Not difficult as in you are difficult as a 1L, but you're hard to survey. So that's the treatment group, because we're thinking of law school as the treatment, that it's going to have some kind of effect. Then there are two controls here, okay? One is Master of Public Policy students. Okay, so that was the graduate degree that seemed the closest, not quite the same, but the closest to law school. Because, again, we're dealing with politics and policy, and they also have some classes, some law classes as well. And so they're the control to see whether or not it's just graduate education that may be causing some change rather than specifically law school. Finally, college graduates of the same age range who have not attended and who are not attending any kind of graduate program was the second control group. Okay, so survey just before and after the first year of law school, and the goal to get them right after is because you don't want the summer experience to start influencing them. You just want the law school experience. And then the $15 Amazon card, well, I mean, that could have an impact, right? If maybe people who are higher on the socioeconomic scale could care less about a $15 Amazon card. It wouldn't motivate them to take the survey. And so maybe you're getting a little bit different population on who's interested in taking the survey. Of course, whenever pollsters are calling people, they have the same problem. Who are the people who actually want to answer the phone? Who are these people who actually want to talk to me? Are these people different than everybody else? And that's always the issue with any kind of survey. Okay, so let's just take a look at this real quick. You see the first wave, then you'll see the second wave. Again, some people didn't respond in the second wave, and some people were not contacted because either they gave erroneous email addresses, or they took the survey so fast that you could tell that they weren't really taking the survey. They were just trying to get their $15 card. So that's the final group that we were left with. Obviously, you always want higher numbers. In the end, you go with what you've got. Okay? All right. So let's compare how the sampled groups compare to what we know about first-year law students based on data that's kept nationally. You can see that the first-year law students are more higher percentage are women than in the sample than nationally. Their higher percentage are Caucasian, and lower percentage are either African American, Latino, Asian American, other races and ethnicities. So much more white and a little bit more female in the sample compared to 1Ls across the country. Also, you'll see they have a higher GPA, a higher LSAT, and tended to go to a higher ranked school than all 1Ls nationally for that year. So they don't quite look like the 1Ls nationally, and that means we're limited on what we can generalize from this sample. Now, we're gonna try to compensate for that a little bit with something that's called weighting, but I'll come back to that in a little bit. Okay, this is also just where you can see where the sample is coming versus where nationally first-year students are. So again, you can see you get a lot. You got over half in the first 50 schools, and then another third A third of those are actually in the top 14 schools. Okay? So again, this kind of minimizes the degree that we can generalize to all 1Ls. Maybe we can just say something about 1Ls who look like the sample. Okay, so let's start with just some raw data. I'm not gonna talk about weighting it yet. One of the questions they were asked is where they were on a scale of a scale that was from very liberal to very conservative. Okay, a 7-point was kind of often called a Likert scale. A 4 would mean they're kind of neither consider themselves conservative nor liberal, right in the middle. For these numbers, the 1 is the very liberal and the 7 is very conservative. So you can see law students didn't change much over the first year of law school. In fact, and they changed less than the general public or the Master of Public Policy students. So everybody started off just slightly on the liberal side of the scale, MPP students a little bit more so, but not much change in the raw. Okay, now let's add in the weights. And what we're doing here is we're weighting the data based on race and ethnicity, gender, and GPA. Okay, so in other words, we're trying to make the sample look like law students nationally look like it has the same racial proportions, same gender proportions, and the same distribution of grade point average. And when you weight it, you see really no change, right? So law students don't seem to be viewing themselves any differently after the first year of law school than they did before, as far as on a kind of liberal to conservative continuum. All right, now let's break it down a little bit, because you can imagine that some folks might be more likely to change than others. And here we see a couple things going on. Now, the blue is just the raw information, and the orange is the weighted. And what you see is all three of the categories that are on the liberal side of things all moved a little bit more conservative. And that kind of looks like a regression to the mean pattern, okay? The more liberal they were, the more conservative they saw themselves after the first year of law school. Again, regression to the mean pattern. And we see a similar thing roughly on the conservative side, okay? The difference is that the degree of change is higher for the conservatives than for the liberals. So the conservative students are becoming liberal more than the liberal students are becoming conservative, although they're both moving a little bit more to the middle. Okay, and this is the same thing, just where all the categories are collapsed. So you just have the 3 liberal, the 3 conservative, and the moderate. Again, you see them, the liberals are becoming more conservative, the conservatives are becoming more liberal, but the rate they're doing it at is a little bit different. Okay, next let's get into specific questions. So Templeton was interested in religion and economics. And so I had to have those questions, a lot of those questions in the survey, but then I also asked questions on a whole host of other things: gun control, affirmative action, unions, LGBT rights, because I thought it'd be interesting to find out about those as well. And you also you don't want people to know exactly what you're asking, right? So you don't want them to know you were focused on religion and economics. And I figure at BYU, people might be curious. So this first question was on a scale of 0 to 100. 100 meaning it would be the pro-religion response. The 0 would be the, I guess if you want to call it, the anti-religion response. And this was whether or not people should have to give up their jobs if there was a conflict between their jobs and their religion. Okay? You see on the unweighted law students, so just the raw data, you see a little bit of a drop. So students seem to be a little bit less pro-religion after their first year, although when you try to make it look like the national sample, you don't see any change at all. So maybe there's just something about these particular students compared to the national population. Okay, another question about religion and speech. Should the government be able to regulate religious speech? You see not much of a change amongst the unweighted, but the weighted students became a little bit more pro-religious speech after the first year of law school. And you would think that law school and law's emphasis on rights would probably make people maybe a little bit more pro whatever the right may be. So in one sense, that's not surprising. Similar question about should the government be able to regulate religious practice? You see a little bit of a drop amongst the unweighted, but a rather significant increase when you weight the data. So again, maybe nationally, students are going to come away more solicitous of religion after the first year of law school, at least when it comes to religious practice. But these particular law students who were surveyed were not. And then finally, just a kind of a general scale of 0 to 100, how important is religious freedom? Again, we see slight drops, but more so in the unweighted than the weighted law students. Okay, economic and property rights. Not much of a change. Not much of a change after first year law school, whether this is just the weighted data. Slight drop maybe, but not a whole lot there. And this was a compilation of questions that went into that. Okay, how about other things? Well, you see maybe a slight drop, but none of these are statistically significant. So it's as though the lines are flat except for one, and this is gun rights. Gun rights dropped at a statistically significant rate after the first year of law school. Now, is that because of something that they learned in law school? Or was that because of external events that occurred out in the real world while they were in law school? I'm inclined to think it's probably more the latter, given that nothing else changed, and given that the Second Amendment doesn't take up a lot of the law school curriculum, but I can't say for sure. Okay, I also had another type of question. So the last one here was just a how important is the right 0 to 100 kind of a thing. This next type of question created positions that they had to choose that range from a liberal to a conservative position. So again, we have a 1 to 7 scale. So this is an example of the one on abortion, right? So maybe the most conservative position is that first one there, and the most liberal position is that bottom one there, and the students had to pick where they are on the scale. And so this is more concrete, right? The 0 to 100 is kind of abstract. You know, my 90 may not be what your 90 is, right? So this forces them to pick a position. The downside is you might read this and say, well, none of those are exactly my position. So I kind of have to just pick the closest one. Again, these are the pitfalls of survey methodology. Okay, so this is what we found. Interestingly, no change on guns on this one. So when you're asking a 0 to 100, how important is the right, guns drop. But when you're asking them to pick a position on a scale of liberal to conservative positions, no change. And that's just the nature of asking questions different ways. You sometimes get different outcomes. Okay, what did we find? The only view that actually went in a conservative direction was on abortion, but it was a negligible one that was not statistically significant, so there's no difference between that and 0 in the guns, essentially. All the others went in a more liberal direction. I know federalism is kind of a funny one to think of as conservative and liberal, but and the federalism, immigration, LGBT rights, and affirmative action were all statistically significant. Unions was not. So those 4 law students were had their views moved in a liberal direction. Okay, finally, that was the weighted data. Now what I wanted to do is go back to just the raw data, just the sample, recognizing that you're probably not going to be able to generalize to law students in the entire country, and wanted to see something a little more sophisticated other than just that kind of descriptive before and after. And so what I'm using is various statistical techniques called matching. Matching is somewhat similar to regression. You've probably heard of regression. But basically what it does is it says we've got to compare apples to apples. And if we have regression tries to look at all of the data, and matching techniques actually gets rid of data and says, you know what, this is just too much of an outlier. I'm not going to even consider it in the analysis. So when you do these kinds of matching techniques, you find a few things. Overall, what you find, the yellow means statistical significance. Overall, you find no change for the most part. On the religious stuff here, very little change. The one thing you do find is that on religious speech, when you compare them to the MPP students and the general public, law students are less solicitous, less likely to protect religious speech. Interesting. And also, overall, religious liberty, a little less likely to protect religious liberty, which is a combination of all four of the questions. But otherwise, no change. Okay, how about on the other economic ones? You see a few things, and you see some interesting things where the three diverge. So when the MPP students are the control group, getting rid of the general public, we see that law students compared to MPP students are less likely to think that free markets lead to success for people, and less likely to think that free markets raise your living standards, and less likely to think that free markets are efficient. Now, compared to MPP students, they also are more likely to think you need government control for free markets to function properly. Okay. Now, when you look at the public, you find something interesting. Law students are less likely than the general public to think that government control is necessary, but think that more government control is necessary than the MPP students. So you start to see some differentiation. The MPP students, the ones who are studying about economics, are the ones who most think that the government shouldn't be controlling free markets. Then you have the law students, and then you have the general public that thinks that the government should have more control over free markets. And then finally, compared to the public, law students are more likely to think that the free markets lead to success, but they're less likely to think that than the MPP students. So what are some general takeaways? It doesn't appear that overall, on average, the first year of law school has a huge impact on at least the political views that were surveyed here. Although conservative students, again, tend to see themselves less conservative more than liberal students see them as less liberal. So they're moving towards the other side at a quicker rate. As far as specific takeaways, so again, the general pattern is not any change, but we do see a little bit less value on religious freedom as a general concept, a little bit more open to regulation of religious speech. On the free markets, again, as we just went through, there are a few areas where law students take a little bit dimmer view of free markets, but sometimes that dimmer view is still a more positive view than the general public. It's just more dimmer than MPP students. And I will say all this with a caveat of this is a difficult population to survey. And so it's hard to know to what degree we can generalize these views to all law students compared to the sample that we looked at. Thank you.
Yeah. I think they recorded this.
That's fine.
Yep.
Okay. Well, awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Phillips, for coming and talking to us. As the Associate Dean for Faculty and Curriculum, I bet there's a class in here at 1 o'clock. So I'm going to try to keep this short, but thank you to the Federalist. There's not?
Cancel.
Awesome. Well, sit back. No. But thanks to the Federalist Society for inviting me to talk about this. I think this is an awesome research project, and I think one of the things that we need more of in the world are facts and data. I think that polarization happens when we paint with a really broad brush and we say things like, all law schools are X, all students are X, all law professors want to do X. law school has this effect, and we don't have data to back it up. So I'm really appreciative of researchers like Dr. Phillips, who are trying to put some data behind claims. So I think I was asked to talk about this from the standpoint of a faculty member or a curriculum member, and I'll try to keep this short. I want to say just a couple of things that might help you with your research, and then a couple of things that just talk about curriculum in general, or first year of law school in general. First of all, I noticed that you had like a footnote that said that this is a quasi-natural experiment because all 1L years are pretty uniform. If there's an exception to that, it's con law. So many schools have con law separated in con law 1 and con law 2. Sometimes con law 1's in the first year and con law 2 isn't. Sometimes con law 2 is optional. And some first years have con law all in the first year, right? So you would have both structures and rights in the first year. In some law schools, you have structures in the first year and rights. Sometimes it's the opposite. So I asked Professor Geddix this morning, I said, if one of our 1Ls took structures, would they be exposed to religious liberty and religious freedom? And he said no. So I don't know. So I think that if you're trying to see if being exposed to religious liberty concepts changes how people feel about them in the first year, you might want to ask, what did you learn in con law? Or what were you confronted with in con law? Also, textbooks are very different. Law students, when you take torts, you only take one torts. Now, you may be sad about that, because torts is awesome. But thank goodness you only took one Civ Pro, right? So I've taught torts, 15 times, and I've used maybe sorry. That was supposed to be a dig at Professor Sansel, not at Professor Nielsen. And I've used 3 different torts books. Okay, there is a law and economics torts book, the Epstein book. There are very pro-plaintiff torts books, and then there are a lot of books that are in the middle, and I've taught from one of each of them. And so it may be different depending on whether you had the perfect torts professor like me, who would say, there's a law and econ answer to this, and there's a Rawlsian answer to this. Those are surprising answers, actually. From a law and economics standpoint, we wouldn't have self-defense. So that's really interesting to think about. But anyway, so depending on what book you have, depending on how your professor teaches it, when they went to law school, when I went to law school, we made fun of the University of Chicago School of Thought, never realizing it would take over the world. So I think there is a little bit more heterogeneity in the first year than we might think. But here are 2 things that I think are more important. And one is that 1L year, so as a casual observer looking at Dr. Phillips's data, I was most impressed with the chart that said that students that said they were, or students that identified with liberal principles got less liberal, and students who identified with more conservative principles got less conservative. And I would say that means that law school did what it was supposed to do. Because I believe that my job when I teach torts is to teach my students, and I know this is being recorded, so forgive my French, to be crap detectors. Okay, I tell my kids, we don't say crap. They go, you do. I go, well, yeah. Okay. And so when you hear people say things, you can go, that's crap. Prove it to me. Prove it to me that the world would be better if we did this, or the world thinks like this, or everybody wants this, or everybody acts like this, or if you do this, it'll create this consequence. And so, by and large, 1Ls should be more skeptical on the way out than they were on the way in if we've done our job, right? And related to that is, because we teach from the case method, we just don't give you like a textbook full of essays on torts. We teach from the case method. The cases that you encounter are the hard cases. And not just the hard cases, the impossible cases, right? So if you came into law school thinking that there was an absolute religious freedom right, or privacy right, or economic right, or property right, then we're going to show you case after case where it's very hard to hold that position through to the end, right? So we're going to show you these cases, right, about how the city of Skokie had to pay so much money to protect everybody so that the Ku Klux Klan could march through Skokie, but it's the Ku Klux Klan's First Amendment right? Or this person had a religious right to say, no, I don't want a C-section, and then the baby died, right? So we're going to show you super, super duper hard cases, right, where I have an absolute property right, but then I do these horrible things and this horrible thing happened, right? And so maybe that's a problem with the law school curriculum, that we don't just teach it to you like we're teaching philosophy. But I think that's the nature of the beast, is that we learn from the super hard cases. And to me, if we're doing what we're supposed to do, then the 1L's answers will go from in August saying, this, never, this, always, to, well, there's a right, and then this person has a right, and we need to balance those in some situations, right? So anyway, I loved this enterprise, and I hope that it is ongoing, and I hope you all enjoy 1L year being around super smart people who disagree with you, which hopefully will lead to more learning and less stereotyping. Okay.
All right, so we have a couple minutes for questions. If you'd like to ask. Any questions?
Do you feel like there is a trend either toward conservatism or liberalism outside of law school, or outside of school in general?
I don't know. I mean, Gallup keeps track of self-identification, and we can certainly look that up. And there have been some studies that show that certain life events, such as having children, owning property, can have impact on one's political views. But I don't know outside.
In your studies, asking people about their ideological biases, have you ever employed implicit biases tests or just the explicit?
No, so just straight up explicit, yeah.
When you're surveying students, do you do it, do you find any difference between different law schools or different regions? Or
I don't remember anything based off of region. And then when you get to the law school level, the number of observations starts to get too small. I did try to survey Pepperdine because Pepperdine has some similarities to BYU in that its faculty tends to actually be split down the middle politically, and I think attracts a different kind of student. But I wasn't able to get enough. Not enough observations to be able to tease that out. So yeah, ideally, you might be able to see some differences based either on self-selection of the type of students who are choosing to go to the school, or maybe there's something else about the environment of the school, but I couldn't get leverage on that.
I will say that one takeaway that you should have is that law schools are very protective of your data, which I think is a good thing. Maybe not for research.
Did you see a difference of political views over the course of a year based off of gender?
I don't think I looked at gender. That's a good question. I'm trying to remember if I saw views based off of gender. I don't think I drilled down on gender, so that'd be something to look at. Yeah.
Have you noticed, or have there been any studies to see what happens after law school? I know, for example, the faculty member, I don't know if she named her, but she's saying she attended BYU. She didn't attend any FedSoc events at all. She felt she was very kind of like middle, or didn't really care about it. But then after graduating, going into private practice, she very involved.
So that sounds like the treatment there, or the